You, bad girl.
Okay, so we are going live right now and we're all set up. Our attendees should be able to see us. It looks like we have 14 people out there so far and people are still streaming in. So welcome everyone to Real and Imagined, Murder Under the Big Sky. My name is China Reavers and I'm here on behalf of the Montana Book Festival. We're really excited to welcome Brian D'Ambrosio, Kelly Suzanne Hartman, Alice Henderson, Keith McCafferty, and Russell Rowland to this year's virtual festival. But first, I want to take care of a little housekeeping. We'd like to welcome you as attendees to submit your questions to our authors via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Sarah Capdeville is on hand, you can't see her, but she's here, to read your questions and pass them along to our authors. Rest assured, we are seeing you. Feel free to use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves while the event is taking place. Sarah will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat for questions. We will be saving the questions till the very end. So if you don't see us answering them, we promise we'll get to them. And with that, I'd like to introduce our authors. Brian D'Ambrosio, who is not on screen right now, but he is joining us today, is a prolific writer of nonfiction books and articles. He specializes in histories, biographies, and profiles of actors and musicians. One of his previous books for Riverbend Warrior in the Ring, a biography of Native American world champion boxer Marvin Camel, was a finalist for the High Plains Book Award. He also wrote Shot in Montana, a history of cinema in Montana for Riverbend. He has written for the History Press and contributes to several newspapers and magazines. He lives in Helena, Montana. We also have Kelly Suzanne Hartman, who was raised in Silvergate, Montana, attending K through 8th grade at the One Room Schoolhouse in Cook City. She was the director of the Cook City, Montana Museum from 2014 to 2016, which included its grand opening. In the summer of 2016, she began work as the curator of the Gallatin History Museum in Bozeman, Montana. Her first book, A Brief History of Cook City, was published by the History Press in 2019. Alice Henderson is a writer of fiction, comics, and video game material. Her love of wild places inspired by her new thriller series, which begins with The Solitude of Wolverines, as well as her novel, Voracious, which takes place in Glacier National Park. Alice is a dedicated wildlife researcher and using a variety of methods, including bioacoustic studies, she undertakes wildlife surveys to determine what species are present on lands that have been set aside for conservation. There she ensures there are no signs of poaching and devises of ways to improve habitat. Using geographic information systems, she also designs wildlife corridors and builds habitat sustainability models and species distribution models. She has surveyed for the presence of grizzlies, wolves, spotted owls, wolverines, jaguars, endangered bats, and more. Keith McCafferty is the author of 8 novels in the Sean Strahannon Mystery Series, published by Viking Penguin Books. He is the recipient of the Will Rogers Gold Medallion Award and the Western Writers of America Spur Award for Best Novel, among many other awards. 2 of his novels were chosen as best reads by Oprah Winfrey's O Magazine. Keith is also a 2-time National Magazine Award finalist and the recipient of the Robert Traver Award for Angling Literature. For years, he has made a living with his fly rod, writing stories for Field and Stream, where he was the survival and outdoor skills editor. It was like flying around the world on a broom, he recalls, only the fly rod was my broom. A wild bird rescue volunteer, Keith lives with his wife and family and various feathered friends in Montana. Russell Rowland was born in Bozeman, Montana in 1957. He has an MA in creative writing from Boston University. Cold Country is his 5th novel and 7th book. His first novel, In Open Spaces, was called A Novel of Muted Elegance by the New York Times. He lives in Billings, Montana. And with that, I'll let you guys take it away.
All right, I am Kelly Hartman, author of Murder Along the Yellowstone Trail, and I was just going to read a little excerpt from my book. The sky was cloudy, a slight wind giving the 60-degree weather a bit of a chill, especially where the road breaks out into the open fields of Montana. It was June 1923. From Bozeman, it's a 30-mile drive to Three Forks down a dirt road known as the famous Yellowstone Trail, with the small towns of Belgrade, Central Park, Manhattan, and Logan along the way. It's about 1:30 in the afternoon when a police car pulls off the road halfway between Belgrade and Manhattan, just a few thousand feet from Central Park. Another car containing a man in uniform and a young woman is already parked there, having come from the opposite direction in Three Forks. In the full group are Three Forks Deputy Sheriff Pierce Elmore, Gallatin County Sheriff Jim Smith, Deputy Max Howell, and a Mrs. Iva Danner. The latter leads the men from the road through thick, tangled underbrush less than 90 feet. They pick their way past disturbed ground where the ghosts of two tents remain in the odd way grass grows back through trampled earth. Iva stops and points to a waterlogged depression in the ground, telling the men to dig there. Equipped with a stick, Smith begins to prod the indicated earth beneath a few feet of water. It's uncertain whether he is skeptical of the woman's story or not, although Elmore was certainly moved enough to give him a call. Nothing had been found the two previous times Elmore had been out there, once just the night before, when he had asked Smith to meet him there. Suddenly something comes to the surface, and there is no mistaking what it is, a human leg bone. Smith feels more confident now of having brought Seth Danner, Iva's husband, to the Gallatin County Jail the night before. Then it had been as a precaution. Now it seems it was a necessity. Smith moves the group away from the depression, sending Deputy Max Howell to Bozeman with Iva, where an official statement will be taken in the presence of an attorney and to notify the coroner in Bozeman. When Coroner E.W. Harland arrives, the digging is commenced, revealing the bodies of two unknown people lying side by side in a shallow grave. As the bodies make their way to Bozeman, they pass a deputy and Iva, who are headed back to her home in Three Forks after taking an official statement. Iva, seeing the conveyance, reportedly faints. In less than 24 hours, her story is on the front page of the Bozeman Avant-Courier. Conscience-stricken wife tells of husband's brutal murders. The obscure Danners quickly become household names, dominating the press for the next year. Her story would appear in its near entirety 4 times prior to the trial, while Seth's would only appear in small fragments. The headlines read like a cross between a detective novel and a soap opera. Slew married pair with camper's axe, wife's accusation. Accused slayer says he loves wife who told. Danner used murder axe as household tool. Slayer's wife tells why she revealed the crime. Fear of husband, not conscience, led to a vow. Mrs. Danner is stepdaughter, accused slayer. Nowhere was the story told in full. Nowhere was Seth Danner given the benefit of the doubt. He was guilty from the very first headline. The murder trial occurred in October of 1923. County Attorney Peterson spoke on behalf of the prosecution for an hour and 15 minutes. In the next day's paper, part of his speech was published. The individual who committed this monstrous crime is no ordinary individual. In 50 years, this building has not been the scene of a trial of such an atrocious and brutal murder. In all the history of Montana, there is no crime which has a parallel. This act perpetrated by this fiendish assassin was done in cruel deliberation and maliciousness. What manner of man is Danner? The defense, as to be expected, painted a different picture. The defense of Danner embraces 4 features. First, infidelity. Second, Mrs. Sprouse finding out the intimacy between her husband and Mrs. Danner. Third, the killing of John Sprouse by his wife. Fourth, the killing of Mrs. Sprouse by Iva Danner. These 4 features constitute and make up Danner's defense. In the presentation of this case, it is not only proper and necessary to consider the test, Danner's statement against that of his wife, there is nothing else to consider. His word against that of hers. Iva Danner was what is called a good witness. Her simple story was direct and brief and to the point with no details. Keep that in mind, no details. Attorney Smith went on to state that the motive of robbery didn't square unless the Ford car and the trinkets and the junk were motive enough. He declared that the real motive was infidelity. As pointed out by Smith, Seth had not been afraid of anything. Why else would he have moved only 20 miles away and kept a home for himself and his family? Smith noted he lived there longer than at any place since he started from his home in Kansas in 1915. This fact is against all the theories of criminology and the psychology of the criminal mind. He ended his speech thus: "There are two questions to be determined in this trial. The first is, if Danner killed Mrs. Sprouse, he's guilty. On the other side, if Mrs. Danner killed Mrs. Sprouse in self-defense, Danner is not guilty. We have summed up our case and rest our fate with you." This was followed by a statement by Attorney General Rankin, undoubtedly a passionate speaker. As written in the paper, when he became too severe in his tirade upon Danner, calling him at times a yellow dog, a dirty yellow beast as yellow as his face is now, and a rapist, thief, bootlegger, and murderer, Judge Law objected to the strong language and said it was unnecessary. In conclusion, Rankin demanded that the jury, if they fixed a penalty, must give no other verdict than death. It was noted that his closing address was one of the most forceful verbal indictments of an accused criminal ever heard in a murder trial in the state of Montana. At 11:00 p.m., it was announced that a verdict had been reached. Within 20 minutes, the jurors were back in the courtroom. The verdict stated, "We, the jury, in the above entitled cause, find the defendant Seth Orrin Danner guilty of murder in the first degree as charged in the information and will fix his punishment at death." The jury had taken 4 ballots. It seems that never had there been a doubt as to the verdict of guilty. The many ballots were taken to determine the penalty. On the first ballot, there were 9 for death, 2 wanted to leave it to the judge, and 1 voted life imprisonment. On the second ballot, 10 were for death and 2 remained who wanted to leave it to the judge. On the third, it was 11-1. On the fourth, all agreed on death. And I currently work in the building where Seth Danner was executed for committing these crimes. And in my research of the book, I've discovered that there's quite a possibility he did not commit the murders. So it was a really fun book to work on, for sure. Whoever's next.
Was this where Brian was going to speak? So am I next?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alice.
Okay.
Yeah, Alice, go ahead. When/if Brian hops on, we're going to have him go at the very end. So it'll be Alice, then Keith, then Russell.
All
Okay.
right.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Alice Henderson, author of A Solitude of Wolverines. Thanks so much for having me here today, and I'm honored to be part of the Montana Book Festival. My novel is the first in a new suspense series about a wildlife biologist who studies endangered species. In the first novel, she lands a gig studying wolverines on a sanctuary in northwestern Montana. She tracks them on foot and sets out remote cameras, but when she reviews the photos, she discovers disturbing images of an animal of a different kind, a severely injured man seemingly lost and wandering in the wilds. Too late, she realizes that she's seen too much. She stumbled onto a far-reaching illegal operation, and now she's become the biggest threat to them. A little about my background. I earned my undergraduate degree in writing and went on to earn my master's degree before I started writing professionally when I worked for a Lucasfilm company in the San Francisco Bay Area. In addition to being a writer, I do a lot of work with wildlife conservation. Sometimes this is remote work on my computer, like mapping wildlife sanctuaries or designing wildlife corridors. But often I'm out in the field doing species presence surveys. In addition to things like tracking on foot, as my introduction said, I employ bioacoustic methods. So I'll set recorders out in the field and take the recordings home, and from that, I can determine what species are using a particular piece of land. This can include species audible to humans like amphibians and wolves, and also ultrasonic calls of bats. And this has taken me to a lot of exciting places. I've searched for jaguars in New Mexico and endangered bats in Arkansas. I've surveyed for wolves and wolverines in Montana, and gone over footage from collar cameras worn by caribou in Alaska and the Yukon. A lot of the work I'm doing right now is pro bono for nonprofits like the Humane Society Wildlife Land Trust. That's an arm of the Humane Society that has wildlife sanctuaries all over the country. I'm also a partner of Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which seeks to create one continuous corridor of land from Yellowstone National Park all the way up into the Yukon of Canada. Y2Y, as it's called, has set aside protected lands in Montana that's greatly benefited wildlife. It was actually in Montana that I first had the idea for this book. One night I was out in the field recording wolves, and I came to the realization that I should merge my two worlds together, the writing career and my wildlife research. So I came up with my wildlife biologist character and devised a thriller plot for her. I spent a lot of time in Montana, and the rugged remote landscape of the Rockies was an excellent setting for a thriller. So I decided each book should focus on a different species. I particularly wanted to address wildlife species that are in danger of vanishing. I also wanted to create a female protagonist with a wide range of skills who had a real survival instinct and could think and fight her way out of dangerous situations. So for the first series in the book, I just had to choose a species to feature, and there were so many that I wanted to address, but I ultimately chose wolverines. And I'm gonna try to screen share here. Let's see. Oh, it looks like it got disabled again. Okay, I guess I can't screen share. I had some photographs of wolverines. Well, I'll just tell you about them then. So wolverines are the largest member of the weasel family, though they only weigh an average of 35 pounds. They've been known to drive grizzly bears off kills, and even they can take down moose. They live in rugged, high alpine areas and roam tirelessly in search of food. Their physical prowess is astounding. In fact, researchers in Glacier National Park once tracked a wolverine who climbed the last almost 5,000 near vertical feet of Mount Cleveland, the tallest mountain in the park, in only 90 minutes. So steep mountain terrain that we would need technical gear to ascend, wolverines just climb as if it's flat. They also roam great distances. One wolverine with a tracking device traveled 220 miles in only 13 days. But these creatures aren't widely known, and their population has dwindled down to only 300 in the contiguous US. So I thought it would be an engaging choice for the first book. Oh, and apparently I can share my screen now. So let me show you some pictures of them. So here they are. They're really, really beautiful. And each wolverine has a unique ventral pattern on their stomachs. So researchers can do a nice non-invasive way of studying them where they photograph their bellies, and they can determine each individual wolverine from each other by doing this. Okay, is the screen share, is it back to, okay. So while researching this book on Montana, I was actually lucky enough to see a wolverine. I mean, some researchers go their entire careers and don't see them, they're that rare. So I was out studying the American pika, which is this little relative of the rabbit that lives in high altitude talus slopes, and it's vanishing like the wolverine due to the earth warming. Pikas live in these high elevation sites. So I was sitting in this talus slope doing a presence survey, and suddenly I heard these hoary marmots whistling an alarm. And I gazed up this slope and I saw these marmots and pikas just fleeing down the rock pile, darting into any holes they could find. And then this wolverine came into view. And it was just powering across this boulder field, not hunting, but just traveling with this singular focus that is so typical of them. It moved across the jumbled terrain as if it were flat, never pausing once. And it got closer and it locked eyes with me. It just looked at me like, "What's up?" And then vanished into a dense cluster of subalpine fir. I was so thrilled. And then I remembered I had a camera, but the wolverine was gone. So my novel, A Solitude of Wolverines, will be out this year on October 27th. And I'm so excited about this series, and I have so many ideas for future books. The second book is already off to my editor, and it features polar bears in the Canadian Arctic. So thank you so much for having me here, and I'm excited to hear more from the other authors and hear your questions. And on to you. Is it Keith? Are you next?
I guess so. Sure, why not?
Or is it?
By the way, the book that I have out, The Bangtail Ghost, has Mountain Lion as a major character. I've been lucky enough to see 7 in the wild and be trailed by 2 of them at night screaming at me.
Wow.
So, very, very interesting. And this is not what I was going to say, but, you know, for years, I was I still write for Field and Stream magazine, and they called me once and they wanted me to take a train to Albuquerque to go chase lion with this old man named Orville Fletcher, who actually has helped study the jaguars along the border there that you're talking about. Well, he's a famous houndsman, meanest bastard I've ever met, just about. But I said, you know, I've got no interest in, you know, hunting a mountain lion. He says, well, this guy's been chasing this cattle killing cat up in the Los Alamos area. And I just want you to ride along with him for a few days. So I did that. And, you know, I wrote the story called The Heart of the Pack because it was fascinating watching the hounds. But I never saw a lion. And it was at that time that I moved to Montana. This is, geez, I don't know, 38, 39 years ago. And I went elk hunting. And to make a very long story short, I was confronted by 2 lions in the night. And that actually is the first chapter of this book is exactly what happened to me, except in the book, I just have 1 lion. So for those of you who don't know it, you know, I write the Sean Stranahan, Martha Ettinger series, and set largely in Southwest Montana in the Madison River area. And I like to paint, you know, a sort of a human scale story against a larger backdrop issue. And this one, it's sort of nature itself and what happens when we interfere with nature. And I wanted to write about cats because I've always loved cats and have even gone as far as India to study tigers for several weeks. And it was precipitated by 3 events. One of them was what I just told you about, being confronted by a lion in the night that followed me. And another one was I was supposed to sign books at the Malmstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls. And they got fingerprinted, you know, the whole 9 yards to take you in there. And the guy met me at the door and they had banners with my face like 10 feet wide. And he says, oh, you've got, you know, a lot of readers up here. You sell a lot of books. I go in there, you know, and sharpen my pencil or whatever, pen, and nobody comes in. And after 2 hours, the guy says, you know, I'm really sorry about this. You know, we deliberately scheduled it for when they're supposed to have a lot of people. And finally, he said, well, what's happened was a mountain lion was spotted on the base and they have a remain in place order. Nobody can go beyond the door that they're behind. So they had armed guards take me out to my car and then escort me out the back entrance of Malmstrom because the major entrance was closed. And I thought, you know, here's a major military installation with who knows how many missile silos in the area. And the whole thing, I mean, enough to bring down a country like France. And this whole thing is brought to a screeching halt by a cat. The whole thing. And I was rooting for the cat, of course, but they found it in a culvert pipe and killed it the next day. So I'm going to read to you the second chapter of this book, which will only take 2 minutes and 15 seconds. So this is called The Fire in Her Eyes. The strangest part of dying was the tickling. It felt like a small bird had caught its claws in her throat and was beating its wings. The sensation reminded her of an old boyfriend who had a gunslinger mustache. Every night he would wash the wax out and work in conditioner to make the hairs soft. Kissing him was erotic once she let herself go, only ticklish on nights when she just went along, happy to bend to his pleasure for the feeling of being close to someone, to hear the words, "I love you," even if they were said reflexively as a sigh. His name was Wyatt. He was in his early 20s. She liked them young then, before she didn't like them at all. And she couldn't remember why they had split apart. She had chosen to veil large chunks of the Tucson years, as she called them, while painting others in a glowing, soft light, like the blush of dawn over the Chiricahuas. Wyatt had been a fine young man in life. He became an even better man now as a snapshot in her memory, when her breathing became labored. How far had she been carried? She could remember nothing after leaving the trailer, not even switching on her headlamp. And one moment she was shuffling along, the snow so cold that it creaked under her boots. And in another, she had come back from some unnamed ether with a tremendous pressure on her throat. She was being carried up the slope of a ridge, her hair hanging down, her head knocking against the downfall, her hands and her boots dragging in the snow. Somehow the band of the headlamp had stayed on her forehead, and its cold white fire cast circles that swirled up through the trees. She could barely breathe, and yet it didn't hurt. I must be in shock, she thought. Finally, the clamped weight on her throat eased. As she lay in the snow, she heard a deep breathing that at first she mistook for her own, followed by a soft, throaty sound, like a muffled outboard motor coughing to life, and then choking out. She turned her head to the sound, and that was when she saw the eyes. They glowed in the reflection of her headlamp with a green tint, like the gemstone known as Arizona peridot, the poor man's emerald. She had worked at a rock shop once, in that half-forgotten, half-misremembered life of adobe and sand and saguaro cactus, where everything had gone right for a while before everything went wrong. Instinctively, she lashed out towards the glowing orbs, and her hand contacted a nap of fibers, like the bristles of a broadhair brush. "What are you?" she tried to say. "Who are you?" She heard an angry coughing sound, followed by what sounded like a scream from the canyon below. Hers? It seemed nothing of this earth. Then the pressure on her throat came back, this time with a searing heat, and she hit at the hard stiffness as she became dreamy, until finally she was only stroking the soft hairs with her fingertips, as if tracing a lover's skin in the dark. What was his name? She couldn't remember, though his face had come back. She saw him clearly. Then he receded, like she was looking at his image through the wrong end of a telescope. Wyatt? The word formed on her lips. She felt happy to have remembered his name. There was a pulsing of light behind her eyelids as her headlamp flickered rapidly and went out. She opened her eyes to the engulfing blackness. No, that wasn't her world anymore. She closed her eyes to try to find him again, and as she did, she felt the fluttering against her throat stop as the bird took flight. So that's that. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak here, to all of you.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks to all the other writers too for being part of the panel, and thanks to Sarah and the rest of the
Right.
Lauren and all the rest of the festival staff. I'm excited to learn that a wolverine is a weasel. So my book, Cold Country, here it is. It came out in November. I'm very excited to have sold the film rights to this book to the production team that did a movie called Winter's Bone with Jennifer Lawrence. It's one of my favorite movies from the last 10 years or so. So that was a pretty big deal, and we'll see if anything happens. But anyway, the basis of this book is sort of loosely based on a period of my life. When I was 10, my father took a job managing a ranch in the Bighorn Valley, down just 25 miles from Sheridan. And we didn't know this until we got there, but the owner of the ranch was one of the biggest owners of one of the biggest construction companies in the world. And he didn't tell any of the other ranch hands that my father was going to be managing the place. So there was a lot of discomfort about us even showing up for this job. It was just a bad time for our family living in this ranching community. We were only there for 2 years, but anyway, I used the basis of this setting to base this book. And it's really not so much about a murder as it is about how a tragedy like that really brings out a lot of interesting dynamics in a community. The main guy, the guy who gets murdered is one of the most highly respected ranchers in this community. And of course, the suspicion immediately falls on the new family that just moved there. But the further you get into the story, the more you realize that there were a lot of people that had a reason to kill this guy, Tom Butcher. So it's really more about the dynamics of small town Montana, which are always fascinating to me as someone who was raised by people who grew up on a ranch. So I'm going to read a little section here. This is right after the murder takes place. The Carl Logan is the father of this family that just moved there. And he had a conversation with the guy who gets murdered just the day before. And so he's already fallen under the suspicion of the rest of the community. And this little section I'm going to read takes place right after the murder. There comes a day in Montana every fall when everything turns. Every speck of color drains from its home and soaks into the soil until spring, when the pigments have rested enough to reappear in a brilliant explosion of color. Overnight, the grass and leaves soften to a muted tan, and the bark on the trees fades to gray until the entire landscape is so overwhelmingly tan and gray that one cannot imagine it otherwise. Even the evergreen mountains, glorious and enormous, cannot save this dull season. In 1968, this change came on a Saturday, the day after Tom Butcher's body was found beaten beyond recognition. The birds pointed their beaks south that morning as though they were feared implication. Flies dropped from the screens, piling in windowsills. Carl Logan awoke as usual before dawn. He sat out in the yard at the picnic table with a cup of coffee. As the light leaked into the sky, Carl felt the effects of the muted landscape. He watched the mountains emerge from the blackness, and he sat thinking with some amazement how quickly his view of these new surroundings had changed. Just a couple of weeks before, this country looked so wide open and forgiving. Now he could almost hear the chatter rolling from the surrounding ranches. Could almost picture the mountains moving toward him, his neighbors descending from the trees surrounding him and his family, closing in, their fingers aimed at his chest. Carl closed his eyes and pressed his fingers into the lids, trying to soothe his thoughts, trying not to wonder if moving here had been a selfish, horrible mistake. He had just decided to make some biscuits and gravy for breakfast before his wife caught up, when Lori burst from inside the house, running toward him with the most frightened look on her face. "Roger's gone," she said. That's it.
Well, thanks, guys. It doesn't look like Brian will be hopping back on, so we're gonna just jump into our Q&A kind of section today. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to send them in the chat or the Q&A. We do have one question first for Alice. Alice, you said that only 300 Wolverines still exist, and that seems like such a tiny number. My perhaps naive question is there anything being done to increase their numbers?
Hey, Penny. Well, the answer is conservation organizations have sued the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service repeatedly to list the wolverine, and they're not willing to. So where it stands right now is in 2016, they were told that they had to re-examine the science, and it's just been hanging there ever since then. But however, there was a new vote on August 31st, but we don't know the result of that yet. So it's pretty sad.
So Alice, can I say something?
Oh, please.
There's been a disputed trapping season on wolverine for decades, and they still have a limited trapping season in parts of Montana, which is absurd considering the numbers.
Right.
Wow.
And it's also, trapping is bad because even if you're not trying to get a wolverine, trapping is indiscriminate. So maybe you've set out traps to catch coyotes or something like that. You could still get wolverines, and those are considered what they call incidental kills. So they're not counted toward the death toll on wolverines.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, in the back of my book, Solitude of Wolverines, there's a section on what you can do to help, what conservation organizations you can support that engage in wolverine research. And there's even opportunities to go out in the field and help track wolverines, especially in Washington State.
Have you been in touch with Jim Williams, the Region 3 Supervisor of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks?
I haven't, no.
Yeah, he's the world's expert on pumas, on mountain lion. Studies them all the way from, from Canada down to Tierra del Fuego. But he also, has been in on a lot of the wolverine research. And you can easily get a hold of him. He's in Whitefish.
Oh, great. I'll look him up. Thank you.
Can I ask Kelly a question?
Yeah.
I was curious about the execution. Was this the last time someone was executed? Okay. And can you tell us a little bit more about the crime?
Yeah. So Seth Danner and his wife and kids were traveling from South Dakota out to Montana in the 1920s. And they were traveling with another couple who were just a married couple. And then they made it to just outside of Bozeman Central Park and stayed for about a month. They were trapping, fishing, just kind of living off the land, living in tents. And in November of that year, the Danners moved to Three Forks, and the couple they were traveling with, the Sprouses, just disappeared. Nobody really knew a whole lot about him. So it wasn't until 3 years later that Iva came forward and said, my husband killed these two people. So it was about a year and a half after that initial arrest and when they found the bodies for them to execute Seth. It went to the Supreme Court of Montana. But like it was his word against hers, and it ended up that he was executed. And it is in the Gallatin History Museum now, is where the old Gallatin County Jail used to be. So the Gallup platform is still there. So when I first went to work there, you have to like walk around that all the time, you know, every day when you're working in this building. And so that's what really drew me to want to learn more about the story, because I needed to like make my own peace with walking under this thing that's so intense. And we just knew a little bit of the story then. So to start doing the research, and then for an exhibit is actually where I started. I'm the curator there. And as I was doing the research, I was like, you know, I don't know if he did this at all. It just wasn't making sense to me. So that's what really made me want to write the book. And since then, I have actually met some of his relatives, because the kids all went to orphanages after his execution. Iva did not want them. So I've been able to meet some people and tell them their story, and it's been awesome. But yeah, they were brutal murders, however it happened. Definitely.
Hey, Kelly, that was
Yeah.
my wife, Gail Schonsler, who interviewed you for the Bozeman
Oh,
Chronicles.
very cool. That's awesome.
And
she did a
told
great
us
article.
how that affected you personally,
Mhm.
you know, like it was a very
Yeah.
traumatic experience, which book writing usually isn't.
Yeah. I was actually having a lot of nightmares as I was writing the book, and usually it was like trying to get out of the building right before Seth was executed. And I would wake up and it would be about the time that he was executed. It was getting a little weird. And as soon as I told Seth's version of the events, my nightmares went away. So for me, it feels like I was supposed to write this book, and it was supposed to be out there, just this different version of events. Because we'll never know what happened, unfortunately. I'm sure we all wish we could time travel.
Alice, what's your next animal?
So the next one is polar bears along the western Hudson Bay, that population, kind of outside Churchill, Manitoba.
And Alice, a question for you really quick. This is from James Ziskin. Dr. Alex Carter is an amazing character, like MacGyver in The Call of the Wild. How much of her skill set do you share?
Thank you so much, Jim. I love that you compared her to MacGyver, actually, because a lot of people remember MacGyver was really resourceful, but what they don't remember was he was also like a champion for social justice and the environment. So how much of her skill set do I share? Well, being out in the field studying wildlife. And the other skill set we share is we both fight the same martial arts style, Jeet Kune Do. So that was a lot of fun to write. She sometimes hears her instructor in her head when she's fighting, like, protect the computer. And that same thing happens to me when I'm sparring. Like, I hear his voice in my head. So those are the main things we share. And of course, our passion for wildlife and trying to help with the plight of wildlife.
Did you learn that skill because you wanted the character to be, because you wanted Dr. Alex Carter to be able to have that skill set, or did you already kind of have that training?
I learned it previously. I started learning it in graduate school, but it's such a great martial art. It's the one that Bruce Lee invented, and it's kind of a mix of all the strengths of all the different martial arts. So it's a great skill because, like, say someone's coming at you like a pugilist, you can step back and use wrestling moves on them, or they're coming at you like a wrestler, then you get up right in their space and you can use kung fu moves. So I thought no matter what situation she was in, that would be a good art for her to know.
That's awesome. And then Keith, are your characters based on anyone in real life? This is from Linda McCulloch.
Okay. Yeah, they all are. That's the at the beginning of a book where they say, no characters are, bear no resemblance to living human beings or whatever. That's the biggest lie in all of fiction, because I think every writer has characters. It's interesting. I have two quick interesting stories. Sean Stranahan, I got his name for my major character because because I wrote so prolifically for Field and Stream and other magazines that after I wrote 2 articles in the same issue, they'd have me do them under a pseudonym. So when it came time to write my stories, I borrowed the name of a friend of mine, Stranahan, and I entered a fiction contest, which I won. And my reward was to be driven upstate in Michigan. I was at the University of Michigan in graduate school, and hunt snowshoe rabbits on snowshoes with a basset hound. That was my first literary prize. But you know, sometimes characters just come to you and sometimes they don't. I knew that in the second chapter of my first book, The Royal Wolf Murders, I needed a sheriff. I didn't know whether it'd be a woman or a man. I knew nothing. And 5 minutes later, it was a woman. She stole my friend's name growing up, Karen Enning. I just made her Martha Ettinger. And I patterned her after a pig farmer I knew on the bank of the Yellowstone River, Gwen Peterson, who was also a cowboy poet. And so that's one of those cases where, you know, I'm lucky. 5 or 10 minutes, I've got the whole story of the, you know, character and her backstory. That doesn't happen too often. You know, I'm sort of a muddler througher. I don't outline or plot. I just sort of go along and see what happens.
Interesting.
I'm not advising it as a productive way to work.
It's a technique.
I've tried to plot, you know, man, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. And then for Russell, from Diana Porter, what are the dynamics of small towns that you refer to? I feel like this is a very complicated question.
Well, most people know that it's hard to break into a small town to get to know people. And I think that's mostly a protective device, you know. And I think also what's interesting is that these small communities, I think there's sort of a safety in, you know, everyone kind of knows each other well. In this one community that we moved into, almost all these ranches along the way had been there forever. So these people knew each other really well. They kind of knew what to expect. And so that's one of the things that was interesting to explore was how do they respond to having their whole sort of safe, quiet lives disrupted by a tragedy. And that brings out a lot of interesting behavior in the characters. So that was one of the things that one of the reasons I decided to throw a murder into the story. It wasn't actually supposed to be a murder mystery, but it just seemed like a good way to stir up that kind of small town dynamic, was to have their comfortable routine disrupted.
And then this is a question for all of you, which is kind of a good follow-up. How do you plot a mystery? This is from Jenny Montgomery. How do you plot a mystery? I'm always impressed by how intricate mystery plots are. Do you figure it out all at one go, or do you have to noodle around and discover it gradually? Kelly, you were kind of smart.
Well, I guess for mine, like my murder, of course, really happened. But I found I got to work a lot like a detective. So going through old newspapers, a lot of old records. We were lucky enough to still have the transcript of the whole trial. So that's really the only place that I could hear Seth Danner's voice. Because otherwise we didn't really have like a whole lot from him. So there's a lot that's, while it's all pretty factual, there's a lot that needs to be like built around it to kind of create these people who are real, but as characters. In a way. So I felt like I had a lot more restriction because I am like kind of stuck to this fact base type level. But I think just, I kind of had to build it from like the end back to the beginning almost, just to sort of piece together how I wanted to express like all the different parts of what had happened and make sure I keep all the drama. And also understanding, like, I knew right away that I wanted to bring it to this close of maybe he didn't commit the murders. So then to like start from this brutal murder to then get to the end and hope people like see there could be inconsistency was kind of my goal.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Keith said, he doesn't plot his mysteries, and that's always been my method too. I mean, I think this discovery of the story is part of the joy of writing, and always has been for me. I think if you try to plan it out, it's usually restrictive and doesn't allow your characters to do their whatever it is they're going to do, because there's always surprises. So
They come to life on their own in a way.
Yeah. I always have a strong first scene, hopefully, in mind. I've got that to go with. And then, so that gives me like 20 pages. And then oddly enough, sometimes I have sort of the last 20 pages. I've got an idea anyway. And then maybe I have that backdrop issue, but that still leaves about 280 pages in the middle where I don't have a clue what I'm doing,
That's
Like,
all?
only 280.
Only 280. That
Only 280, right.
Boy, I'm the opposite. I plot and plot and plot before I start writing. For me, one of the tricky parts is you want to plant these little seeds along the way so that the reader might read a clue without even realizing it was a clue. And then when it starts, as the mystery progresses, you want them to think, wait a minute, was that important, or was this thing important? And you want them to like think maybe they know, but not be so obvious that they're like, oh geez, it's the butler. I mean, come on, and just kind of going through to the end of the book. So that's my favorite part, is planting all these little seeds along the way that when you get to the revelation, it's like, oh my gosh, of course. But it's hard.
sounds way more strategic.
If you write your book and then you can insert those things later too.
Right. Constantly going back and changing, because everything you're writing is contradicting something earlier. And
Yeah.
so they say, when you get that downdraft or first draft, realistically, the way I work, and I think the way Russell works, that's like the 20th draft. Anyway, it's hard work, man.
Understatement. I have a question for Russell. Why do you think your book was chosen to be a movie?
Oh, geez.
And that's from MDZ Plotter.
I have no idea. Well, it was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal, which was a nice surprise. And the guy who contacted me saw that review and bought it. And I don't know what he saw, but I guess, I try to create a lot of visual. I mean, I watch a lot of movies, so I suppose my writing depicts a lot of the visual, the scenes and setting and characters visually in a way that maybe would lend itself to that. I don't know. I really don't know. I should have asked him that. But
Just to help with the next one, to make sure that one gets turned into a movie too.
yeah, I better do that. Make sure.
Get the tips. From Jason Patnode, I have a question for Alice. Well, first he says, these are all great sounding books. Suspense books set in the wild are my favorite. So good job, guys. But for Alice, do you travel to the places your books are set in for research? And what settings do you have planned after your next book about polar bears in Churchill?
I do indeed travel to where my books are set. Montana, I've spent a lot of time in, which is where A Solitude of Wolverines is set, kind of way northwestern, almost at the border of Canada. And then as far as what settings do I plan after my polar bear book, because the polar bear book and the Wolverine book are set in kind of cold, snowy locations, I was thinking it'd be neat to set it in a warmer place, like perhaps Mexican gray wolves in New Mexico, to see how Alex fares in more deserty locations, or I'd love to set one in Utah Canyon country. So those are some of the things I'm tossing around in my mind for the next book.
Yeah. And I kind of want to open that up to everyone here, as this will likely be our last question. But for the books that we discussed today, they all explore different facets of Montana Big Sky. Where else would you like to set your books, or what other settings kind of inspire you? Any of you guys?
All of my books have taken place in Montana, and I have two that are almost done that both take place in Montana. So I probably am not going to be leaving anytime soon. To me, Montana is such a fascinating and diverse state. I mean, not diverse racially, obviously, but diverse in other ways that I just think there's a lot that has still not been explored here. So so far, I haven't been tempted to go anywhere else.
Yeah. Keith, Kelly, anything to add?
Well, when I started writing, I've seen Montana change a lot. And when I started writing, there were established writers like Craig Johnson, C.J. Box, who are both really nice men who've helped me a lot. But they write about these sort of iconic lawmen in these huge, wide open Wyoming counties. And it's perfectly legitimate because those places do still exist. But the Montana I moved to is quite a bit different in Southwest Montana. We have a shift from, agra mining, the traditional extractive industries, to more recreation based. I like to say, well, Montana's gears run on fish slime, trout slime. And I thought that was it creates an interesting area because you have all these large old family ranches being sold off and sectioned off and as a result, you get all kinds of people living next door to each other in a place like the Madison Valley. I mean, you can have a state senator living next door to a bartender, living next door to a medical marijuana grower, next door to a fishing guide. I say, well, it's like all walks of life walk together. And necessarily so because the state has so few people that, at least when I moved here, if you wanted to talk to people, you had to talk to people who were outside your own sort of socioeconomic class. So that's the Montana that I write about as of now, anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would just like to thank you all. Thank you to Kelly Suzanne Hartman, Alice Henderson, Keith McCafferty, and Russell Rowland. Congratulations on Murder Along Yellowstone Trail, A Solitude of Wolverines, The Bangtail Ghost, and Cold Country. Thank you as well to our sponsors, the Whitefish Review, Black Coffee Roasting Company, and Stockman Bank of Montana. And thank you to everyone watching and participating. You've been a great audience. I know there's a lot of people in the chat saying thank you to you guys. I know they really appreciated it today, as did I. Just as a reminder, you can purchase books by these authors and many others at Fact and Fiction's website, factandfictionbooks.com. I also urge you to purchase Montana Book Festival merchandise at montanabookfestival.com. There you can also donate so that we can continue our programming after the festival with our MBF Plus events. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you all.